So many people requested this in the comments plus on the Discord server, so here we go. The biggest country rivalries in Asia. Throughout history, a few countries have had relations of animosity towards each other. Sometimes this was because of a difference of culture, religion, claims over territory, or simply because of stupid arguments between rulers who dragged their people into meaningless conflicts. These conflicts at their time of origin are important because they paved the way for a non-friendly relationship between a lot of states, changing the course of history in the process. I already did this for Europe, taking a look at a few of the biggest country rivalries there, so now let's do it for Asia. Since the last video about this topic was in Europe, let's start with the country closest to Europe, with the rivalry of the Ottomans/Turks versus Russia. This all begins in early medieval times. Slavic and Turkish people have been in contact for centuries. Medieval Turkish kingdoms like Khazaria, Volga, Bulgaria, the Crimean Khanate, and others were established in parts of present-day Russia. The Turks in Anatolia were separated from Russia by the Black Sea and by the Caucasus Mountains, and these Turks founded the Ottoman Empire and began expanding outwards, while Russia was doing the same. And so, claiming parts of the same territory, the two empires began a series of clashes over the Black Sea. The collapse of Constantinople in 1453 to the Muslim Ottomans marked the end of the Christian Byzantine Empire, and Russia became the seat of the Eastern Orthodox Church, and its rulers inherited the Byzantine Orthodox legacy, which might have also contributed to increasing the conflict. After this, the Ottomans started supporting small Turkish and Islamic vassals within Russia, which further aggravated things. At the same time, Russia helped Christian and Orthodox populations inside the Ottoman Empire rebel against their new rulers. In more modern history, Europe also played a role in making the situation worse. Germany, for instance, started having close relations with the Ottoman Empire, and this caused an increase of Russian support to the Balkan nations who were against the Ottomans. It's crazy to think how some medieval kingdoms settling where they did somewhat started a chain of events that contributed towards a world war centuries later. But I guess that's how everything in history works. Eventually, the Ottoman Empire collapsed and became the Republic of Turkey. The Russian Empire became the Soviet Union, and now the Russian Federation. These days, relations are somewhat better, although some disagreements remain, with conflicts between the two happening in neighboring regions. But the Russians weren't the only enemies of the Ottomans. There is another: Persia, now Iran. It started with the establishment of the Safavid dynasty in Persia in the early 16th century, and a power struggle inside the Ottoman Empire. Apparently, there was some type of internal fight for the Ottoman throne, and once Selim I became emperor, he thought that it had been the Safavid dynasty who had been supporting his internal opponents. So he used that as a reason to go to war. The initial conflict culminated in the Battle of Caldiran in 1514 and was followed by a century of border confrontation. So it seems to have started as a conflict between rulers, evolving into common claims for territory at certain points, and eventually also being a conflict between their different interpretations and following of Islam. Eventually, in the 18th century, they reached a somewhat peaceful agreement to coexist, but some tensions still remain. But the Turks versus the Iranians aren't the only rivalry in the Middle East. This is a region with a lot of animosity between its countries. Another one is Iran versus Saudi Arabia. This one sadly remains a relationship of conflict and rivalry. For instance, the countries have no diplomatic relations since 2016. The two countries have significant differences, even today, that explain this animosity. They have different interpretations and ways of following their religion. One is an absolute monarchy, the other is an autocratic regime with elements of parliamentarism, but under theocratic rule. To my knowledge, at least from what I could find, there was no particular rivalry or even relationship between the two states or their predecessors before the transformation of Persia into Iran, or the current state of Iran to better put it. Only in 1929 they signed a friendship treaty. However, the friendship quickly went wrong for the reasons we've seen. Saudi Arabia itself also has other rivals, such as one of its closest neighbors, Qatar. Historically, there isn't much to this one, but since it's a current event, I thought I'd mention it. Before 2017, the two countries maintained cordial ties, and Qatar was actually mainly subservient to Saudi Arabia in matters relating to foreign policy. But a change in power in Qatar saw them reclaim their sovereignty in foreign affairs, often diverging from Saudi Arabia, and this caused tension between the two states, leading to a breakdown of diplomatic ties and even somewhat of an economic blockade. Moving east, one of the biggest rivalries in the world between countries, and one of the two on the thumbnail, India versus Pakistan. This one starts with a key moment: the independence of British colonies in the region. When the British Empire decided to give independence to the British Raj, dividing it into India and Pakistan, they allowed the 680 princely states that made up the territory to decide which of the two countries they wanted to join. With the exception of a few, most of the Muslim majority states acceded to Pakistan, while most of the Hindu majority states joined India. This caused a gigantic transfer of population between territories, with some people wanting to live in the new country of India and some in Pakistan. These transfers of population were apparently somewhat chaotic, and thousands of people perished in the travels, causing each country to blame the other for it having gone wrong. The reason for these migrations, the difference of religion, also helps us understand the origin of the problem, the conflict between the two faiths. Another issue came from the fact that they emerged from the same area and thus claim parts of the same territory. The state of Junagadh was an example, having a mostly Hindu population but a Muslim ruler who joined Pakistan, causing India to not accept it. Kashmir had the opposite situation, a mostly Muslim population ruled by a Hindu king, except this one wanted to remain independent, while both countries wanted to annex it. The initial conflicts over mutual accusations, religious differences, and mutually claimed territory, all caused by the way independence from the British came to be, was what caused the rivalry to start, lasting in part until today. Pakistan is India's biggest rival to the west. To the east, they have another one, whose rivalry is rooted in different reasons, and this is China. The first records of contact between China and India were written during the 2nd century BC. Buddhism was transmitted from India to China in the 1st century, for instance, and trade relations via the ancient Silk Road acted as economic contact between the two regions. From the 1st century onwards, many Indian scholars and monks traveled to China, while many Chinese scholars and monks also traveled to India. It seems that during these early times, the relationship between the Chinese and Indian ruling dynasties was peaceful. They had good relationships, reinforced by the exchange of knowledge, sharing of religions, and trade. The first example of a major conflict came only in the 18th century and didn't happen with India as a whole. This was the Sino-Sikh War. In 1841, the Sikh Empire invaded Tibet, and Chinese forces defeated their army, forcing them to withdraw, and then a mutual agreement of non-interference with each country's frontiers was signed. During British occupation of India, the English used that territory somewhat as a base for their opium wars against China. When India achieved independence, the first position towards China was one of friendship between the two largest Asian nations. But this wasn't fully achieved, as an old problem came back: Tibet. It had traditionally served as a buffer zone, and India believed it had inherited special privileges in it from the British Raj. However, efforts for cooperation continued. In 1950, India established diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China, being the first non-communist nation in Asia to do so. And in 1954, they finally signed an agreement regarding Tibet, granting its rule to China. But then, in 1959, the Dalai Lama, spiritual leader of Tibet, sought sanctuary in India, where he established the Tibetan government in exile. China then accused India of expansionism and imperialism in Tibet and throughout the Himalayan region, claiming over 100,000 square kilometers of territory over which India's maps showed sovereignty, and demanding rectification of the entire border, and thus a border conflict began, in which some military skirmishes actually took place in the 1960s. China became closer to Pakistan and even backed them in their conflict with India in 1965, while India was supposedly supporting Tibetan rebels. Another conflict came to be later in the region of Sikkim, demonstrating the main issue of the relations between the two countries, the dispute over the border. However, it seems that more recently these issues have been resolved, with compromises on each end and the beginning of what seems to be a peaceful coexistence, where the rivalry only remains as the two compete to be the world's biggest economies. China itself also has a few of its own rivals. One of the biggest is Taiwan. Taiwan used to be a part of mainland China, but after the Civil War, once it became evident that the People's Republic was victorious, the Kuomintang, who was in charge of the Republic of China, fled to Taiwan, and this was around 1949. The two governments continued in a state of war until 1979, when a key event took place. The US recognized the People's Republic of China in the mainland. After this, Taiwan implemented a policy called the Three No's, which are no declaration of independence, no unification with the mainland, and also no use of force. Essentially, their rivalry has lasted since the Chinese Civil War, as they both represent the two opposing sides. The conflict has dialed down and thankfully gone past military issues, but the People's Republic still claims a one China and wants to eventually incorporate Taiwan, something which the heirs of the Kuomintang are mostly against. In a speech in 2017, General Secretary Xi emphasized the PRC's sovereignty over Taiwan, stating that we have sufficient abilities to thwart any form of Taiwan independence attempts. However, Taiwan remains effectively independent since 1949. The rivalry with the mainland also remains, sometimes having periods of closer approximation, sometimes of increased tension. Further south, we have other examples, like Vietnam. China and Vietnam had contact since the Chinese Warring States period and the Vietnamese Thuc dynasty in the 3rd century BC. But this contact soon became that of two enemies. Between the 1st century BC and the 5th century AD, Vietnam was subject to 4 separate periods of imperial Chinese domination. During one of these, there was a large Han-Chinese migration into Vietnam. Chinese soldiers and fugitives from central China migrated en masse into northern Vietnam since then and introduced Chinese influences into Vietnamese culture, with Vietnam only achieving independence again in 938, but even after this, several wars took place, sometimes between independent Vietnam and China, and sometimes alongside European colonial powers, like the Sino-French War, when French controlled the region of Indochina. Then came Japanese occupation, but after the war, US President Franklin Roosevelt decided that the French should not return to rule. Roosevelt apparently offered the Kuomintang leader all of Indochina to be under Chinese rule, but they reportedly refused, replying, under no circumstances. Later on, during the Vietnam War, the People's Republic of China was an important ally of northern Vietnam. The historical rivals had now become allies. And during this, China waived all territorial claims in Vietnam until the South was defeated, also attempting to use this opportunity to increase their influence. But then, the temporary allies became enemies again. Vietnam went to war with Cambodia in 1979, and China supported their enemies, while the USSR supported Vietnam. But in 1991, with the dissolution of the USSR and Vietnam's 1990 exit from Cambodia, the Sino-Vietnamese ties began to improve and seem to be on a positive note these days. As we move towards the Southeast Asia region, there are a couple other rivalries that are worth mentioning, like Malaysia versus Indonesia. Malaysia and Indonesia are two neighboring countries that share a lot of similarities. Their national languages are closely related and mutually intelligible, and both of them are Muslim in their majority. Since independence, Indonesia and Malaysia have moved in different directions in their social, economic, and political development, leading at times to moments of tension. The unequal pace of democratization in the two countries has made the relationship increasingly problematic. They also have a few territorial disputes, as seems to be common with neighboring states. Most of the current borders were inherited from the Dutch East Indies and British Malaya, and currently both nations are in a territorial dispute over the oil-rich islands of Ambalat, also fighting over sea borders in the Straits of Malacca, for instance. Going back up north, there's one we really can't skip over when speaking about this, and that is North versus South Korea. Formerly a single nation that was annexed by Japan in 1910, the two nations have been divided since 1945 and engaged in the Korean War from 1950 to 53. The rivalry can be pretty much explained this simply. After Japanese occupation came the division of the country, which was very much related to the Cold War and the desire of both the US and the USSR to have the country in its sphere of influence. The north side was supported by the Soviets and then the Chinese, and the south by the Americans. Even after the Cold War, the north continued to close itself off and be more aggressive towards its neighbor. However, recently there have been some causes for hope, with new meetings between leaders, joint participations in the Olympics, and signed agreements that seek a peaceful coexistence and eventual unification of the Korean people. And finally, speaking of Korea, one of its biggest rivals throughout history, Japan. For over 15 centuries, the relationship between Japan and Korea was characterized by cultural exchanges and economic trade, but also political contact and military confrontations. In 1641, a Korean king formed an alliance with Japan, and Chinese culture was introduced to Japan via the Korean peninsula. Later on, the Mongols attempted to invade Japan through Korea with the support of the local Goryeo kingdom. In fact, many of the ships used by the Mongols to try and invade Japan were built by the Korean king, ships that were all destroyed by a storm, by the way. In the 16th century, unified Japan decided to invade Korea since the Koreans had refused to allow Japanese soldiers to pass through their lands to attack China. But Korea was able to maintain independence for a while, and in 1897, the Joseon Kingdom was renamed the Korean Empire. However, they were under heavy Russian influence, and when Japan declared war on Russia, being victorious, Korea became a protectorate of Japan. And this lasted until 1945, time when independence and division happened and the events we just talked about before took place. The rivalry between the north of the peninsula somewhat remains, but the relations with the south seem to be positive as far as I know, although there are still some wounds left to heal because of the occupation and war. So those are a few of the biggest country rivalries in Asia. Thanks to everyone who made suggestions on this, especially on the Discord server. Speaking of which, if you want to join the server and talk to me and other subscribers, the link is in the video description. Someone also suggested, in a more positive note, to make a video about the biggest country friendships / alliances in the world, and I think that's a good idea, so let me know in the comments if you'd be interested in seeing that. Thanks for watching this video, and subscribe if you want to catch the next ones. I will see you next time for more general knowledge.